Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the Philippine event series of Bridges, Dialogues Toward a Culture of Peace, hosted through the International Peace Foundation and De La Salle University, Manila. My name is Gerardo Largoza, and I will be your host for this afternoon. Please rise for the invocation to be delivered by Brother Victor Franco, FSC, of the Board of Trustees of De La Salle University, Manila.
In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit, amen. Let us pause and recall that we are in God's presence. Heavenly Father, you call us to build a world worthy of our dignity as your children, where the goods of the earth are shared, and where dehumanizing poverty in all its ugly manifestations is relegated to a nightmare of the past. Grant that we may use our talents and intelligence to realize your vision, your magnificent dream for your people. Grant us the gift of discernment to discover the manner in which to realize this dream in today's four-speed world. And grant that we might one day stand in your presence and hear you say to us, "Well done, good and faithful servant, for you fed the hungry, clothed the naked, sheltered the homeless, created jobs for the unemployed, cared for the weakest and most vulnerable of my children, moderated the greed of the unscrupulous, and thus brought peace and prosperity to all." Amen.
Please remain standing for the singing of the Philippine National Anthem to be led by the De La Salle University Chorale.
Bayang magiliw, pwede sa silanganan, alab ng puso, sa dibdib mo'y buhay. Lupang hinirang, duyot ka ng magiting, sa manlulupig, di ka pasisihin. Sa dagatang bundok, sa sibuya, sa langit mong magaw, may nilagang dula at awit sa paglayang minamahal. Ang kisam ng watawat mo'y tagumpay na nagdilingding, ang bituin at araw na kailan pa may di magdidilim. Lupa ng araw ng walhagit pagsinta, buhay ay langit sa piling mo. Ang ligaya na pag may mga api, ang mamatay ng dahil sa'yo.
Please be seated. To formally welcome everyone to this afternoon's event is the President of De La Salle University, Manila, Brother Armin Luistro, FSC.
Your Excellencies, beloved colleagues in the academe, friends and partners in business and government service, our dearly beloved students and guests. In what is now the third lecture in a series organized by the International Peace Foundation, we are blessed to have as our resource speaker a person who has distinguished himself in the field of international development finance, but more renowned in his capacity as former president of the World Bank. a position he held for 10 years. Today, I pray and hope that Dr. Wolfensohn will share his thoughts on how peace and progress could be achieved through multilateral and individual state action in a world that has seen many significant changes in the last couple of decades, but continues to experience many fissures: political, economic, ethnic, religious, and cultural. Fissures that deter closer collaboration among nations and among the sectors within nations. For a country that has been continually rocked by debilitating and damaging episodes of conflict, and whose progress has been stunted by the equally unbearable deficiencies in our political institutions and leaders, I eagerly anticipate Dr. Wolfensohn's views on how to facilitate partnership among nations and consensus building among leaders of a country so that we could move forward towards the elusive goals of peace and progress. I am especially interested in hearing Dr. Wolfensohn's views on how multilateral financial institutions, international intergovernmental organizations, international and local NGOs, and even governments impact on our collective trek towards the universal goals. I completely concur with the conviction of the economics professor Douglas North, who pointed out that institutions do matter in keeping nations up to speed in the increasingly complex and competitive world we live in. Though we are glad that the political divide has collapsed and we have seen significant progress in reducing the developmental gaps among nations, we are all too wary about the deterioration of the capability of institutions and also our leaders to eliminate intrinsic dysfunctions in the economic and political spheres. Just yesterday, in his Asian Institute of Management talk, Dr. Wolfensohn noted with dismay the Philippines' poverty incidence, which has worsened from 2003 to 2006, despite the economic growth of the country. I also view with grave concern his views that rising poverty in the Philippines is partly due to government measly spending on education. I will be very interested to listen to his thoughts on this, especially as we welcome Dr. Wolfensohn to De La Salle University, Manila. On behalf of the university, let me express once again my profound appreciation to the International Peace Foundation for facilitating the visit of our esteemed guest through the Bridges program. I heartily welcome all of you to our academic community and encourage you to pursue further your reflections, both personal and institutional, on your inimitable, albeit significant role in envisioning harmonious cooperation among nations, working towards the attainment of peace and progress in the world. If we desire any real contribution to harness partnership across boundaries, we need to network with other organizations and groups sharing the same goals. No sector can do this alone. It is my dream that we will all find ourselves engaged in this exceptional task and invite others to join us in our crusade in building a better and brighter tomorrow. Thank you very much, and welcome to De La Salle University.
Series, Bridges, Dialogues Toward a Culture of Peace, hosted through the International Peace Foundation. De La Salle University, Manila will confer upon Mr. James D. Wolfensohn, Chairman of Wolfensohn and Company, LLC, and former President of the World Bank, the honorary degree Doctor of Humanities. I invite Mr. Joaquin Quintos IV, Chairman of the Board of Trustees of De La Salle University, Manila, Brother Armin Luistro, President of De La Salle University, Manila, Dr. Carmelita Quebenco, Chancellor Emeritus of De La Salle University, Manila, and Mr. Wolfensohn to join me on stage. Please stand at the center.
citation. Whereas Mr. James D. Wolfensohn, born in Australia and a naturalized U.S. citizen, holds BA and LLB degrees from the University of Sydney and an MBA from the Harvard Graduate School of Business. Before attending Harvard, he was a lawyer in the Australian law firm of Allen and Hemsley. He served as an officer in the Royal Australian Air Force and was a member of the Australian Olympic fencing team. Whereas he is chairman of Wolfensohn and Company, LLC, a private investment firm, and an advisor to corporations and governments. He is chairman of the Citigroup International Advisory Board and advisor to Citigroup senior management on global strategy and on international matters. Whereas he was the 9th president of the World Bank Group and was the 3rd president in the World Bank's history to be reappointed for a second 5-year term by the Board of Executive Directors. As president of the World Bank, he traveled to more than 120 countries in order to pursue the challenges facing the World Bank in regard to poverty and environmental issues. He successfully led initiatives on debt reduction, environmental sustainability, anti-corruption programs, and AIDS prevention and treatment. He developed activities on religion and culture and decentralized offices overseas linked by the most modern telecommunication system in the international community. Whereas, prior to joining the World Bank, Mr. Wolfensohn was an international investment banker. His last position was as President and Chief Executive Officer of James D. Wolfensohn, Inc., his own investment and corporate advisory firm set up in 1981 to work with major U.S. and international corporations. He relinquished his interest in the firm upon joining the World Bank. Whereas in May 2005, he assumed the post of Quartet Special Envoy for Gaza Disengagement, a position he served until April 2006. In this capacity, he helped coordinate Israel's planned withdrawal from the Gaza Strip and spearheaded reconstruction efforts as Palestinians assumed sovereignty over the area. Whereas throughout his career, he was closely involved himself in a wide range of cultural and volunteer activities, especially in the performing arts. He has served as chairman of the Board of Institute for Advanced Study at Princeton University for the last 18 years. In 1970, he became involved in New York's Carnegie Hall, initially as a board member and later as chairman of the board. In 1990, he became chairman of the Board of Trustees of the John F. Kennedy Center for the Performing Arts in Washington, D.C. He is currently chairman emeritus of the Carnegie Hall and of the John F. Kennedy Center for the Performing Arts. Whereas he has been president of the International Federation of Multiple Sclerosis Societies, director of the Business Council for Sustainable Development, chairman of the Finance Committee, and director of the Rockefeller Foundation and of the Population Council, and member of the board of Rockefeller University. He is an honorary trustee of the Brookings Institution and a member of the Council on Foreign Relations and of the Century Association in New York. Whereas he is a fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences and a fellow of the American Philosophical Society. He is a recipient of several awards for his volunteer work and his contributions to the arts. Among these awards are the first David Rockefeller Prize of the Museum of Modern Art in New York and an honorary knighthood by Queen Elizabeth II. He has also been decorated by the governments of Australia, Belgium, Brazil, France, Japan, Germany, Georgia, Mexico, Morocco, the Netherlands, Norway, Peru, Pakistan, and Russia. Wherefore, in recognition of his outstanding achievements as a banker, leader, volunteer, and patron of the arts, the Board of Trustees and the academic community of De La Salle University, on the occasion of the Philippine event series Bridges, Dialogues Towards a Culture of Peace, hosted through the International Peace Foundation, are pleased to confer upon James D. Wolfensohn, eminent banker, tireless international volunteer, renowned patron of the arts, distinguished leader, the degree Doctor of Humanities honoris causa, given in the city of Manila this 6th day of March in the year of our Lord 2008, and the 96th year of De La Salle University, Manila, Philippines. Signed, Joaquin E. Quintos IV, Chairman, Board of Trustees, Brother Amin A. Luistro, FSC, President and Chancellor. Yours truly, Chancellor Emeritus.
Mr. Joaquin Quintos IV will read the authority from the Board of Trustees of De La Salle University, Manila.
Upon the resolution of the Central Board of Trustees of De La Salle University Incorporated, in accordance with the pertinent provisions of Republic Act Number 7722, otherwise known as the Higher Education Act of 1994, and by virtue of Memorandum Number 59, Series of 2007, of the Commission on Higher Education, De La Salle University, Manila, Taft Avenue, Manila, hereby confers the degree of Doctor of Humanities, honoris causa, upon James D. Wolfensohn, given at Manila, Philippines, the 6th day of March, 2008. Signed, Armin A. Luistro, FSC, President and Chancellor. Yours truly, Chair, Board of Trustees. Congratulations, Dr. Wolfensohn.
To impose the doctoral hood is Dr. Carmelita Quebenco. Congratulations, Mr. James D. Wolfensohn, Doctor of Humanities. We now pause for an intermission number from the renowned De La Salle University.
Sama-sama nating abutin, pinakamatayong na bituin.
At ang aking tagumpay, tagumpay ng aking lahi, tagumpay ng aking libing, ang tanging binibigin at hinahanap.
Hanggat ko'y tagumpay natin.
Lahat
at sa sama-sama nating pagsisikap, sama-sama rin mararating ang iba't ibang tanong, isang pagtutulungan, ito'y sa harap, kasama pulan. Sama-sama natin abutin, pinakamatayang na bituin.
At ang aking tagumpay, tagumpay ng aking lahi, tagumpay ng aking ibig, ang tanging pinipili at hinahangat.
Hangad ko'y tagumpay natin lahat. Hangad ko'y tagumpay natin tagumpay natin lahat.
Thank you, De La Salle University Chorale. Ladies and gentlemen, as you now know, this event is entitled Bridges, Dialogues Toward a Culture of Peace, a program hosted through the International Peace Foundation. To tell us more about the Bridges program, may I call on stage the chairman of the Board of Directors of the International Peace Foundation, Mr. Uwe Morawetz.
To the first ASEAN event series, Bridges, Dialogues Towards a Culture of Peace. Bridges is facilitated by the International Peace Foundation, a non-political and non-religious foundation under the common patronage of 21 Nobel Peace Prize laureates based in Vienna. The events are hosted in cooperation with various local partners, including the country's major universities, and I thank De La Salle University and its president, Brother Armin Luistro, for hosting our event today. Having started in November 2007, Bridges is being continuously held in the Philippines and Thailand until April 2008, involving the participation of Nobel laureates and other eminent keynote speakers. The first ASEAN series of Bridges is an independent contribution to the Decade for a Culture of Peace and Nonviolence, initiated and promoted by the United Nations General Assembly. It follows a series of 250 Bridges events, which the International Peace Foundation has already hosted in Thailand between November 2003 and April 2005. 26 Nobel laureates, as well as 12 other keynote speakers and artists, such as Dr. Hans Blix, the Reverend Jesse Jackson, Vanessa May, and Jesse Norman, participated in these events. They were presided over by Her Majesty Queen Sirikit and Her Royal Highness Crown Princess Mahachakri Sirinthorn, and reached an audience of 70,000 participants. As peace cannot be achieved instantly, but is a process which needs time, Bridges have not been organized as a single event, but as an ongoing series of events in which Nobel laureates and international decision makers have built strong bridges with leaders in all parts of society and with the general public. With the basis for peace being education and synergies being the fruit of cooperation, the International Peace Foundation has not realized Bridges alone, but has carried out the program together with UNESCO and 75 other national and international institutions, including 23 universities and schools. The multidisciplinary and pluralistic approach of Bridges in Thailand and of the events in the Philippines reflects that peace involves all parts of society. It involves the awareness and social responsibility of politicians, the business community, scientists, artists, and the media. And since peace within ourselves, our families, and our environment starts in our minds and hearts, it involves every one of us. In this sense, Bridges challenges us to cross borders and to build bridges by listening and opening up to other viewpoints, by generating new thoughts, by developing innovative forms of cooperation, and by fulfilling the desire of everyone to get to know and to learn from each other. This can lead us to a world in which we will be able to understand each other and the complexities we face today in a new light. A globalized world needs broad strategies for change to secure a sustainable future for us and the next generations. Let us be inspired by the knowledge and the wisdom that Bridges continues to offer, an opportunity to get a more inclusive, interconnected, and comprehensive view of ourselves and of the world in which we live in and which we are able to create anew constantly through dialogues towards a culture of peace which need the participation of everyone. I thank Mr. James Wolfensohn, the former president of the World Bank, who has agreed to come to the Philippines to support the events, and we now look forward to his keynote speech and to his important contribution to build bridges. Maraming salamat po, mabuhay, and welcome, Mr. Wolfensohn.
Brother President, Chancellor, former President and Chairman of the Board, may I thank you firstly for the honor that you've given me in awarding me the honorary doctorate. As someone who had to struggle to get my degrees, I find this a much easier way. It takes a couple of hours, lunch, and a very pleasant ceremony. And so for those of you students who think it's difficult, try the honorary route instead of the other. Excuse me. Thanks. The other thing that I'd like to say is that I very much appreciate the music introduction. I thought you were presenting Superman when I heard this music, and was only disappointed that it wasn't that after the introduction that you gave me, which I found both embarrassing and slightly untruthful. But I'll be out of the way before you discover the truth about my background. The reason for my remarks today, or at least the subject for my remarks today, is to try in particular at a university to bring to your attention some of the issues that I've been concerned about over this last decade, and which, quite frankly, are of concern to me, but are of much more importance to you and to your future when you graduate, and for those of you that have graduated in the years ahead. As I look around the room, there's a substantial age difference between me and at least the people behind the first four rows. And it's to you that I really want to speak, because I think that the issues that we're facing today are not issues that my generation can do a hell of a lot about. They're issues which we have participated in, but they're issues which, frankly, will determine the question of peace and security and equity and justice and the environment on our planet. And they're issues which will be for you to look at and for other university students and graduates throughout the world. The issues arise very clearly from the growth patterns that we have experienced. These growth patterns, as you probably know, have, since World War II, brought us to a stage over these last 50 years when we look at the world, we think of it in terms of a two-part world, a developing world and a rich world. The world of the last 50 years in which I have been active has been perceived by my generation as being a world in which there's the United States and there are the OECD countries. And these rich countries, which have, as of the year 2000, maybe 1 billion people in them, have more or less 80% of the global income and global wealth. And then there are 5 billion people who live in the so-called developing countries, who have 20% of the global income. That sort of 80-20 analysis and 80-20 sharing of income has related to a sort of 1 billion to 5 billion global distribution of people. And in my day, growing up in Australia and then subsequently working in the United States and in international institutions, the question was, how can the so-called rich world and the more developed world assist the developing world in its advances, both as a matter of what you should do because it's right, it's charitable, it's something that you should do if you have a conscience, and also something which gradually came to people as being something that was more than that. It was the development of markets, and it was the development, in a way, of stability on our planet. In the 18th and 19th centuries, rich countries tended to conquer other countries in order to build their resources and to embrace them in their empires. Come the 20th century, there's been a much greater understanding that what is important is to expand your business and your financial activities. And it's not necessary to conquer, it's necessary to have trade, it's necessary to build your own standard of living and the standard of living of your people by being able to advance internally your country, but also to trade with the rest of the world. The numbers are significant. In this part of the world in 1990, 1991, we had about 8% of the global GDP. By the year 2007, this part of the world in Asia had about 15% of the global GDP. Let me put that in perspective, because if you go back historically, in the year 1500, China and India were 50% of the global GDP. 40, China and India were 50% of the global GDP. And they dropped back, along with the rest of Asia, against the Industrial Revolution and against turmoil in the region, to a low of 5% for India and China, and now an emerging India and China, so that by the year 2025, or better still 2050, in that year, far from being 15% of the global GDP, India, China, and this region will constitute 60% of the global GDP. 60%. This is a tectonic change in terms of development, and also the world gets bigger. In the 50 years from 2000 to 2050, the world grows from roughly 6 billion to 9 billion people. And of the 3 billion that comes onto the planet, only 100 million go to the so-called rich countries. All the rest go to the developing countries. So it's very obvious in terms of demographics, it's very obvious in terms of the way the world is moving, that it's a new era for Asia, it's a new era for development, and it's a new era for the world generally to come to terms with. The Philippines itself, as I'm sure you know, has shown significant growth. But as I've learned just yesterday with the statistics that came out from your own government sources, the impact on poverty is a much less than I had frankly thought it was before I came here. Your own statistics talk of the last 5 years of a move from essentially 30% to 33% of the population still living in poverty, as you define it. And so in the Philippines and in Thailand, where I've just been, and generally in Asia, we've seen that there are advances, but that in the case of your country, those advances are probably more slow than you would have wished. And one of the reasons I think that they're more slow than they would have wished is that sadly the level of investment in education on a public basis in the Philippines is, I would say, significantly less than probably what is required to be competitive and to have the advances that you need in a modern society. And in talking yesterday to your president and in talking to others here, I hope and pray that this is something that is both recognized and will be acted upon, because it is surely at the center of the development paradigm. The other thing that has happened in this period has also been the shift in resources. 12 years ago, when I came to the World Bank, we were worried about countries in Asia, including this one, including Korea, where individuals were giving their jewelry in order to have it melted down to make gold because of the lack of resources in the central bank, where the Asian region looked as though it was having more than just a cold, it was having influenza and even worse. And now today we have a situation where, in terms of the weight of foreign exchange reserves on the planet, which in total today are around $5,000 billion, $5 trillion, more than $3 trillion, more than 60% of it, is in Asia. There's been this is not just a trivial swing in 12 years. This is a revolution in terms of the resources of the planet. And of course, significant amongst that has been the role of China, where today we see that of the global resources of something over $5 trillion, China has $1.3 trillion. And this year will grow another 300 billion, and is likely to be, at the end of this year, $1.6 billion. These are not accounting adjustments. These are not just numbers. This is a massive change in terms of the way our world resources are moving. And we find also a significant massive change a bit of a distance from here in the oil-producing countries, which themselves are also showing, relative to their population, unbelievable accumulations of resources, particularly when you have petroleum running at $100 or better. And what does this mean for the future in terms of the role of Asia? Well, it's not just the reserves which can be reinvested, but the sort of consensus forecasts, which I quote, are that between now and 2025, in China, there will be 600 million people with an average income in today's values between $13,500 and $50,000 a year. A group of 600 million. And a little behind that, in an India which by 2025 is likely to be equal in size or slightly bigger than China, we have another 580 million people who are in the middle class, between $11,000 a year and $100,000 a year. These numbers, of course, vary with the analysts that have done them, but the truth of the matter is that you will have created in India and China a middle-class population of a good 1.1 billion or 1.2 billion people. This is no longer a world that one perceived as developing or poverty. This is a world of a very substantial middle class that will rival the consumptive capacity of countries like the United States and Europe as well. So we're in the midst of a major change in terms of the way we look at Asia, the way we look at the world, and within Asia, a major change as we think of the countries that are not India and are not China, that are moving along in the Asian movement, but where they too will be challenged by the capacities, the resources, and the development within the largest countries of India and China. And yours, being one of them, will also be challenged to try and find, with give or take 100 million people, where it is that your particular niche is to be found, in technology or in services or in the provision of services overseas by your population. But that clearly the country will have to reassess its own competitive position as you look at your giant neighbors who will be not only growing in terms of people, but prospering in terms of economics. And I think you already know that within the Philippines, the other issue which is hugely important to be addressed is also the difference between the rich and the poor in the country, which puts you ranking about number 3 in the world in terms of the comparison of wealth and poverty within the context of your country, so that there are very large differences between rich and poor. And the issue of education, again, as I speak as a new recipient of a doctorate at a university, the issue of education becomes crucial in terms of meeting that challenge. The other interesting thing which is worth thinking about is that this old analysis of the rich countries and the poor countries, or the developed countries and the developing countries, really is not adequate now to analyze the way our world is going. There's a need to think, as was mentioned earlier in the invocation, a very moving invocation, that there is a 4-speed world. There is the world of the rich countries, the United States, the France, the Germany, the England, the OECD countries, which in the next 30, 40 years will grow probably 2.5 times. They're rich, and they will remain rich. They will get richer on a per capita basis. Then you have what has come to be called the globalizers. They're the countries now like India and China and a bunch of other countries in the developing world that have shown a propensity to grow quickly. Countries like Cambodia, Chile, Hungary, Indonesia, Kazakhstan, Thailand, Malaysia, the Russian Federation. These are all countries which have growths of above 3.5% a year. And in the case of India and China, close to and above 10% a year. So this rate of growth is really very, very substantial, running between 5 and 10 times the rate of growth in the rich countries. Then you have a bunch of countries where their per capita income is less than the $14,000 of that second group, but where they're growing at less than 3.5% a year. And these are the countries, quite significantly, that are another billion people on our planet. They are the countries of Argentina and Egypt and Costa Rica and Iran and Mexico, Syria, Uruguay, Venezuela. These countries have before them not trivial growth, but it's growth which many countries would in fact today be happy to have, which is between 2 and 3%, 3.5% a year. And then there are a billion people left in the countries which are really the poorest countries, significantly in Africa, but not limited to Africa. In your own region, we have Bangladesh, we have Comoros, we have Haiti, not quite in this region, but a few countries outside Africa, Pakistan, another being part of it, but significantly in Africa, with 1 billion people, are really committed, or at least likely to have limited or no growth and where there is substantial poverty. The only growth they have is in population, and that population tends to run at between 3 and 4% a year on average. And so in the space of another 25 years, that billion will be probably 2 billion. Population doubling every 25 years at a 3.5% rate. So as we look forward to this world of 2050, we're confronted with a world in which the rich will still be rich, in which you'll have India and China, which will be a lot richer with a very, very big middle class, where there will be a bunch of countries that will be doing okay, but not fantastically. And on our best estimates, 2 to 2.5 billion people who really haven't had much of a shake at all, and which represent, in the case of Africa, 25% of the world's population. And maybe another 500 million or billion people that have been left behind in the Chinas and Indias and the developing countries of the world. Now, the interesting thing about this, and indeed the worrying thing about it, is that there are of the order at that stage of about between 2-3 billion people, as it is true today, who still live under the proverbial $2 a day, and 1 billion or so that will be living under the equivalent of $1 a day. But unlike 50 years ago, when people in poverty really didn't know very much about what's going on in the rest of the world, the thing that you recognize, and I've seen with my own eyes as I've traveled around the world, is that you can be in almost any part of Africa or any part of the developing world, and someone has a wind-up radio or an earpiece or even a computer in the village, that the flow of information about what's happening in the rest of the world is no longer limited. In fact, it's encouraged. And for those that are trying to bring about less than benevolent development, there's an opportunity to create really a group of people who are angry about their lot in the world, and where reactions, whether it be in terror or in uncertainties, are very apparent. There are a number of studies that have shown that if you get X% of the population under the age of 25 and there is no growth, that you typically get actions that are malevolent, or disruptions within the country, or disruptions between the countries. And this has been true historically. But whereas once it was held back a bit by lack of knowledge, today there is no lack of knowledge in the developing world. And there's a responsibility for us to view this not as just a defensive moment, but to look prospectively, not just at the billion or more in India and China that are reaching the middle class, but to look at the issue of equity, of social justice and the environment in a way that is now, thank God, starting to be looked at by the leading countries. I say thank God because I can tell you that in my period at the bank, it was pretty lonely talking about these issues. My own experience was in both government circles and also when you talk to private sector, as I've done here and I've done in other places, is that particularly when you talk to people that are not in government, or even audiences like this, you have a sort of 24-hour cycle. If you're lucky and you're on a good day, you can convince people that there may be a problem, that it's not as it was before, that there's something out there which has to do with the growth on the planet. There's something out there which talks about equity and poverty. And there's something out there which either appeals to you in the sense that if you don't do something about it, things might be turbulent and turn over. Or I guess if you're in an environment like this, with a strong moral background from the church, you may think of it as something which is abhorrent and which you need to do something about. But my own experience is that you can get the attention of an audience for 24 hours, that if you're lucky they'll go home and talk to their kids about it, and the next day it's business as usual. And you disappear and you get on the plane, and within a week everything you've said is forgotten. Sadly, that's been my experience in moving around the rich countries. And sadly, it's something which I don't foresee an instant change. If you look at the American presidential elections today, there isn't a mention of these global issues. 4 years ago, I convinced an interviewer called Jim Lehrer, who may or may not be known in this country, to ask, when he was interviewing the presidential candidates, a question about poverty and development. He happens to be a good friend. He'd drunk a lot at my place for dinner, and so he promised that he would do it. So I wrote him a question. It took 93 seconds to ask the question and have it answered. It was not an issue that the presidential candidates wanted to talk about. And this time in the presidential debates, I was unsuccessful in getting a question in on the issue of development, because it's not a hot domestic political issue. And so the hot domestic political issues around the world are essentially short-term, visible, local. And when you talk about what's going to happen in 10 years or 20 years or 30 years, people look at you as though you're a dreamer or a civil servant or someone who has a job that they have to try and talking about these things. And it's just at a different level of reality than the level of what is important today. The trouble is, if we don't do something about poverty today, if we don't do something about our environment today, we're making our bed for tomorrow. Education, as I need hardly say in this institution, is at the core of change. And I have no doubt that the brothers who work in this order find their job fulfilling, but even with the number of institutions that they have around the world, inadequate to deal with the question of poverty and education to the level that they would like. And this is something which, fortunately, we're now seeing a bit of a change. The most interesting change is coming from the leadership of China. And for those of you who read your local newspapers this morning, you would have seen that the Chinese government and the leadership, Hu Jintao and Wen Jiabao, and in particular this morning Wen Jiabao's speech, is addressed to the question of poverty, education and environment. This is what was put forward in the last Party Congress, and it's being put forward not as a matter of theory. It is being put forward as a matter that unless China deals with these questions, you will not have stability in China. In fact, for those of you that are going to go to the Beijing Olympics, you will already see, in terms of environment, just what a problem it is in that city and in the area around it. And we've seen, thank goodness, since 1997 in the Asian Initiative for Integration, and more recently in the work plan that they came out in 2002, that the nations of this region have come out with 107 projects, and in 4 areas: in infrastructure, human resource development, information and communications technology, and regional and economic integration. This is a 6-year plan, a crucial plan that has been adopted by these countries. And we're seeing, fortunately, in the coming together of the Asian nations, an increasing recognition that the future of any individual country has to be tied into the future of the region, and that it is absolutely essential that one confront the question of poverty if one is to confront the issue of continuous peace and the opportunities for one's children. The truth of the matter is, of the 20 most polluted cities in the world, 14 of them are in China. And we also can add to that Delhi, Calcutta, and Tokyo, which are in the top 10. So the issue of environment is certainly something that one can see in the region, but thank God the Asian countries are finally taking a look at this and doing something about it. I've just come from Bangkok, where certainly a great deal has been done to improve the quality of life in that city, but it must be extended beyond that. And the other thing that we're seeing is that gradually this part of the world is no longer being perceived as inactive or as part of the problem. We're seeing finally that with the leadership of China and India, issues of development and issues of poverty are being developed around the world. You know that in the last 2 years, we had a meeting of all the heads of government in Beijing, and African heads of government, I should say, are now planning their next meeting in Beijing because China has reached out in a very real way to Africa. Simultaneous with that, 400 businessmen from Africa met in India. And again, an indication that this South-South, as it was called, or this liaison between developing world and the developing world is not just being addressed in theory, but being addressed in practice. But that does not mean that there will not be poverty and there will not be inequity in the region, which will be challenging as an economic matter, challenging as a political matter, and challenging as a moral matter. It's also something that is challenging as an environmental matter, because with poverty frequently comes degradation of the environment. And so these are issues which are not theoretical. They may not be instantly visible. But the other thing about them is that they are long-term issues on which, if you're going to address them, you must start now. We cannot say that on the environment we'll start in 10 years' time. We cannot say on education that we'll start in 10 years' time, when we're ready. The cycle of education is unfortunately longer than that, starting even at preschool education, at the first 4 years of life, where education and healthcare come together and where the real human capacity is brought together. And so we really have a group of younger people particularly really angry about the allocation of resources and pushing for change in terms of the development paradigm. We cannot wait to address the questions of poverty. We cannot wait to address the questions of environment. These are not issues for tomorrow. They're issues for today. And it's why I enjoy speaking so much at universities, to try and get people even more angry than they might be already, and to get them out there to do something to make my generation feel guilty and to turn things on their head so that the world 20 years from now is better than the world that we're bequeathing to you. Thank you all very much. I think I'm now going to sit there, if I'm correct. Not quite sure why, but I...
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Wolfensohn. Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Wolfensohn has been most kind to agree to answer some questions at this part of the program. So for that purpose, we've made 2 microphones available there down the center aisles. In the usual fashion, before you ask your question, could you please introduce yourselves and state your organization or school affiliation? Yes, please, ma'am.
Good afternoon, Dr. Wolfensohn. I'm Cristela Daquila from DLSU, Manila. I'm with the Economics Department. You've talked about the presidential elections in the U.S., and you said there is a big indifference among, well, the presidentiables in terms of outlook are indifferent with regards to what's happening to the developing world. They're more concerned with domestic issues. I'd like to know what is your take on because immigration is an election issue. Immigration policy is an election issue in the U.S. And what is your take on the contribution of the developing world to the developed world in terms of manpower? We have a lot. Our economy now is buoyed by overseas workers' remittances, and because of the demographics too, the aging population in the developed world and the young labor age structure in the the aging population in the developed world and the young population in the developing world, will this help balance this equilibrium in terms of poverty alleviation? Because our middle class in the Philippines, we have an emerging middle class because of the overseas workers phenomenon. Thank you.
Well, I think it's an extremely important question, particularly in this country, where I think, if I'm not mistaken, you have $15 billion worth of remittances coming into the country as a major component of your annual GDP, and which shows just what can be done in terms of the accumulation of income by expatriate workers. But the other side is absolutely clear. The other side is that in many countries, and including the country in which I live, in certain segments of the society, we couldn't exist without foreign workers. And may I say, in the case of Philippine workers, both in household workers and in particular in the hospitals, where I happen to have an issue at the moment with a grandchild who was born very early and has been there 11 weeks, and a good half of the nurses are from the Philippines. So I am brought daily into the confrontation with exports from your country that are making a huge contribution. And with the aging population that you put your finger on, there is a real need in many countries, including in Europe, which draws not much less from the Philippines, but from Eastern Europe and to an extent from Asia. There is a growing need for young people to come and fill the gap. But there is an ambivalence in many countries. They're very keen to have the services, but they're not keen to change the national profile of the country. You have in Germany, for example, 2 to 3 million people of Turkish extraction. And yet Germany is unlikely to accept Turkey in the European common market because of the sentiments of the German people. And yet Turkish participants, I have in Uwe here somebody who is from Germany, I should ask him this question. But there is the dilemma of the need for young people in aging populations. And where there is an aging population in Europe and within the United States with birth rates of 1.5%, you cannot keep up with the need for young people in the society. Now, in the United States, historically, they've been much more open to immigration, significantly from Mexico, as we see today, but not limited to Mexico and Latin America. And it's been a country that has absorbed migrants. And in fact, of the growth that we're talking about in terms of the United States, significantly, it's a migrant growth. So I think that you will see this happening as a matter of necessity. But I have to say that I would anticipate in some countries that there will be a national reaction as you see changes in the visible ethnic mix of that society. I might tell you in the case of my own country of birth, Australia, I was there about 15 months ago with some Australian friends, and I was walking around Sydney and was walking around Melbourne on 2 separate occasions. When I grew up in the 50s, I remember going out and, in 56, 57, 58, going out and complaining against what was then called the White Australia policy. There was a limitation on Asian immigration to Australia. It was perceived as a European nation. And the last thing we wanted was to have a whole bunch of Asians coming into the country, at least the last thing that my parents' generation wanted. And so as a student, we used to go out and demonstrate and say, listen, these guys are studying with us, these girls are studying with us. It's ridiculous to think in terms of the future of the country not having an Asian component. As I walked around the streets of Sydney and Melbourne this time, it is stunning to see how the composition of the country has changed. For anybody of you that knows the country or has been there, the number of Asians that are living in Australia, and then when you talk to them, talk to you with a broad Australian accent, it's really quite disturbing that we're infecting Asians in such a way that they can't speak English anymore. So I'm quite worried for Asia, but it's a tremendous change in the space of 50 years, and I think that in answer to your question, it is inevitable that you will have immigration, and in particular, as we've seen from the Philippines into certain countries. But I can't be assured that there will not be a reaction, as in some of the countries they see a change in the character of the country any more than the Germans have all the Turkish residents there to be German citizens, or that in some other countries there is a reluctance to have foreign citizens in those countries. In the Middle East at the moment, you have, I think, if I'm correct, in one of the countries in the Middle East, you have 2 million, I think, Philippine workers. They're not being offered local citizenship. They are working, and they're not living in the greatest conditions. They're making good money. It's a good deal, but in terms of immigration, it's not something that's on the cards. So I don't know where it's all going to go. As you know, in the United States at the moment, the issue of Mexican immigration is becoming a very central issue in terms of the politics of the day. But my guess is that very large numbers of those immigrants will be embraced in the country. And as you travel, as I have, in the southern parts of the country on the border and in California, you will find huge areas that speak only Spanish. So there is a change going on, and it's a change that's driven by demographics, driven by age, and also driven by the capacity of communications to get people from place to place. The big challenge at the minute in Europe is the extent of African migration, and that is a separate subject which I'm happy to come back and give another lecture on next year. It's a bit too long to comment on today.
Yes, please. Oh, all right.
Good afternoon, sir. I'm Dino De Leon from third-year Student Development Studies. I'm from the Debate Society. I'd just like to ask, sir, since we're talking about poverty eradication, international organizations such as the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund actually play a crucial role in terms of poverty eradication. A Nobel winner for economics also criticized the International Monetary Fund heavily in the name of Professor Stiglitz. I'd just like to ask, what's your take about these particular criticisms, and what are your suggestions in order to reform these conditionalities that are being criticized by Professor Stiglitz?
Well, Joe Stiglitz worked for me for a few years and was chief economist at the World Bank, and is brilliant and is now a Nobel Prize winner. And he's certainly venting a number of his frustrations about the Monetary Fund publicly at the moment. I think Joe is right, but not in confronting things on the basis of the fund's activities. My own take on it is that the truth is that rich countries basically play with the question of development. The level of overseas development assistance is thought to be going up each year. It's now about $120, $130 billion a year. But when you analyze it in terms of the increases, significant, some tens of billions are on debt relief, significant increases from the United States and elsewhere are going to Iraq and Afghanistan and to areas of conflict. And in the underlying funds that are going to development, the level of overhead which is affecting the monies that are going into developing countries is really criminal. It's not criminal because they're not criminals, but when you look at the amount of money that is announced to be going in development programs and the amount is actually arriving in terms of cash, you'd be lucky to get 30 to 40% of the nominal amount going in terms of active projects. And it's not growing. Countries like the Scandinavian countries are at the so-called 0.7% of the GDP which they're putting into it. Holland is at 0.7%. A few countries are at 0.7%. The United States is at 0.15%. I think the UK at the moment is 0.2, 0.25 and growing. Germany is the same, France is the same. They've all announced that over the next 5 to 7 years they want to get up to 0.7. I'll believe that when I see it. And the truth of the matter is that it's not a hot domestic issue in most countries. And one of the great problems that I think exists for the world, as it exists in individual countries, is that rich people and middle-class people and rich countries and middle-class countries pay a concession to poor people. They talk about it. And to poor countries. But frankly, they don't do a hell of a lot about it. It's not a domestic issue in most cases. It is a long-term issue, not a short-term issue for political cycles. And we haven't seen the emergence of great leaders in the world who have been able to bring it to the attention of the world in a way that one would hope. I hope we could have a couple of Mandelas who could be out there talking about this issue that could convince the world. But they're not around. And so I worry tremendously about not just Joe Stiglitz's criticisms of the fund, but I would extend it beyond that. I think that the criticism is not of the fund and not of the World Bank per se. It is that, first of all, the system is not working terribly well. But I think personally the issue is much broader than the system. I think our planet doesn't recognize that we will have instability and certainly inequity unless we start soon to look at the question of social justice and of sharing some of the wealth. We are not doing even what we say we will do when we say that we will give 0.7% of the incomes of countries to development. The average number is nearer 0.2, 0.25. And while that happens, we're not going to make progress. I admire Joe and what he's saying, and I hope he keeps saying it, but my own judgment is that the issue is a little broader than the monetary fund.
Yes, please.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, Dr. Wolfensohn and ladies and gentlemen. I'm Andi Amri, a fellow of Asian Public Intellectual, the Nippon Foundation, from Indonesia. I'm doing research on community development and coastal resource management in Indonesia, Thailand, and the Philippines. Since I'm doing research on these topics, I met a lot of people with extremely poor. In my understanding, property have a remarkable relationship with the environmental issues, peace, hunger, and prosperity. If we talk about poverty, sometimes in case of Indonesia, I don't know, in the Philippines, if we go to the poor people and we ask them, are you poor? They will answer, sorry, I'm not poor. But we say that I have something for the poor. Oh, they said, oh, I'm also poor. Yeah, I I'm now 1 month and 6 days in the Philippines, and I travel in coastal area of the Philippines, Metro Manila. I observe close to the Manila Bay, there is the large mall in Southeast Asia. They call Mall of Asia. And in the way go to the Cavite, Baclaran, we found out so many small house in the surface of the water. I also visit Ethiopia, the poorest countries in the world. But I was very surprised because there is so many luxury cars, there is 5-star hotels. I spent my time in Japan for 5 years, maybe the second developed countries in the world. But in front of my university, Kyoto University, there is so many homeless. And in Tokyo Bay, there is about 10,000 homeless. So it seems that there is a gap between the have-us and the have-not. So my question is, how to deal and how to tackle this kind of chronic phenomenon for the peace and prosperity? Thank you very much.
Well, I don't know whether I have seen as many poor people or not as you have, but I spent 10 years going to more than 120 countries. And I guess I've seen literally hundreds of locations of abject poverty, and I didn't go from the World Bank just to the Prime Minister's residence and to the palaces. I thought it was important to get out in the field. So I think I have a pretty good overview of poverty in the world. Maybe not as good as yours, but certainly better than most people. And I had the same experience as you in the first instance, that poor people don't... The first thing is that you don't solve it by money, in my judgment. What poor people need is not money. They want an opportunity. They want a chance. They want something in which they can do something for themselves and do something for their kids. The number of times I had in the worst slums poor parents with their kid properly dressed in front of you, telling you that this was the future and this is what they were concerned about. I mean, that happened. It didn't matter which continent you were in, and you've probably seen it yourself. It's this devotion to the kid and the opportunity to have some continuing means that they can generate income themselves, as distinct from getting a handout. What you say is right. If you go along and say, I will give you something if you're poor, they'll tell you they're poor. And I guess I would do the same. But I think the real issue is, how do you get in the poorer areas of the world, wherever they are, a framework in which you can change the dynamic, get to the young people to give them an opportunity for education, which is the great liberator, get to the issue of health. I would add personally the question of environment, because I think the environmental issue is significant in every sort of way. And in terms of where our planet is going, I actually believe that there's plenty of evidence that if you get bodies of young people to a level of 25-30% of the population that are not getting employed, you have typically disturbance of one form or another. So I think there is a self-interest question to try and make sure that you can deal with the question of poverty. I think there's a moral question that you should deal with the question of poverty. And what I'm seeing is that, as I quoted here now, in this region, within the last 5 years, 3 of the major conferences of the ASEAN and the meeting of the Communist Party 16th Annual Congress and the view of the Congress Party in India are all coming out and saying roughly the same thing now. We cannot defer the question of poverty, equity, social justice, and environment. That's a change over the last decade. And I just hope that it'll be followed through. Your analysis, your question about what do you do about it, the first thing you have to do is to get the local governments, and we're seeing that in the case of India and China, addressing this, both because it's right and because it's a big political issue. The question that I have is, to what extent will they dig down deep enough to have the 2 billion or 3 billion people in the world that are living in more or less poverty alleviated when there's a world of 9 billion, not just a world of 6 billion? How can we get to that point? And I think you can only do it if middle class and rich people are prepared to recognize that their future is not just dependent on how much money they can amass, but is dependent on how much equity in the society you can have. And that is a trick that we've not yet succeeded politically to sell, but which has to be sold if we're to have peace, in my judgment. I won't be around to see it, but I truly believe that as a matter of passionate conviction. Yes.
There's a small queue forming on both aisles, so with Mr. Wolfenson's permission, we can have the questions one after the other, starting from the center right
Sure.
now.
Good afternoon, sir. I'm Carlos Muncion, De La Salle University, from the Finance Department. First of all, I'd like to say thank you for just including poverty really in your speech this afternoon. My question is, there's a recent ADB study. Actually, it was just released, I think, this morning. And talking about poverty, that despite the trumpeting of the said growth here in this country, poverty has grown from 24.4% to 27.9%. And they see it, there's a lot of reasons. No? Number one is the fewer tax collections that result into insufficient infrastructure, and they have also cited corruption as one of the reasons. I think my question is, what is your view about these things? Or let me rephrase my question, how can you make us more angry about these persistent problems?
I don't think in the last couple of days that there's a great need to make you more angry. From what I've seen in press statements and what I've heard talked about for the last 2 days, it does seem that at least amongst a substantial group of the population, including ex-presidents and ex-government officials, if I read the advertisements correctly, there is a significant reaction at this moment. It's something that I have learned in this country comes in waves. You get excited about corruption for a while, you jump up and down, and then things get quiet. You have a new president, and then it happens again. That may be a very unfortunate outsider's image. It's probably not correct. But maybe this time there's a recognition of the fact that the issue of corruption has to be addressed, and I think you need to do it and have been doing it with the Supreme Court and getting that right, and all. There is no secret in how to get things right. It's not rocket science. It is a set of rules, and it's a set of actions that the people want to take. And I think one of the reasons that people are getting angry, and I didn't see that particular study, but I also dated the 5th of March, is a release by the National Statistical Coordination Board of the Republic of the Philippines,